see anybody. I'll just pretend no one's here. My name's Chloe Daly, and I'm the proprietress of Reading Frenzy, a local bookstore devoted to independent media. Feel free to clap. So we produce dozens of free art and literary events every year, but we had a feeling we couldn't accommodate this crowd in our 600 square foot bookstore, and we were right. So I'm not sure how many of you there are, since I can't see anybody. So thanks for coming out, and thanks to Alberta Rose Theatre for helping make the event possible. David Graeber is an anthropologist, author, activist, and anarchist. He's written several books, the most recent being Debt, the First 5,000 Years, which he's here to talk about tonight. He's also one of the key instigators of Occupy Wall Street, so both timely topics. Debt, the First 5,000 Years, is an anthropological history that debunks multiple commonly held beliefs about money, credit, and debt, as well as a political argument concluding, I think it's my favorite quote so far, but I have to admit I didn't finish the book last night, concluding that perhaps the world really does owe you a living, and he'll be talking more about that. So the books are for sale out front, and we're offering a special deal since you paid a few bucks to help make the event happen. You can get that back if you purchase a book tonight. And the last thing I wanted to say was don't be intimidated by the 400 pages and, 200 pages of footnotes. Mr. Graeber's writing is accessible and engaging, and what he's put forth in this book may change our understanding of both economics and society if enough of us read it. So, David Graeber.
Thanks so much for having me. I guess this is billed as a reading or
Lecture,
what's that? Lecture talk. Yeah, I was trying to figure out what to do. Here, I actually got a copy of the book, so I think so. I'm going to do that at the end. I figure maybe I shall talk. You just don't want to hear. You don't want to hear just me reading. That's boring. I think I will talk a little bit about how I came to write this book. You're right. Bizarre and staring into darkness. People with white shirts, I can kind of make a vague bridge thing. How I came to write this book. I will talk about that. And then perhaps describe a little bit about what I myself discovered in writing it, because one of the nice things about writing a book like this is that when you start this incredibly ambitious project, you don't actually know what you're going to come up with. Or sometimes you do and you're wrong. So I discovered all sorts of things, and I still haven't completely gotten over the excitement, despite having had to give talks like this about 400 times. This is my fourth today. In one form or another. How did I come to write this? I come from a very political background, but for most of my life I wasn't really all that political. My father fought in the Spanish Civil War, for example, and he lived in Barcelona at a time. He was in the ambulance corps, so based in Barcelona. He lived there at a time when it was, organized on anarchist principles. And basically run by, anarchist unions and local associations. And I guess I always thought of myself as an anarchist as a result, even though I guess he never really, he's sympathetic with anarchism. He thought it was a legitimate political philosophy. I don't think he ever really came down on one side or another of the issue himself personally. But in a way, it's almost inevitable if you grow up in a household where anarchism is considered a reasonable political philosophy, that you will become an anarchist, because the way I think of it is, most people don't think anarchism is a bad idea. They think it's insane. Yeah, sure, I mean, if we didn't have cops in prisons and everybody was nice to each other, that would be great. Dream on. That's generally the attitude. So if you know that it's not crazy, that it's actually been done, well, why not be one? There really isn't any very good reason other than implausibility. So I always like the stories about Spain. They made a great impression on me. I think the one thing I really remember the most that really brought home to me was the fact that white-collar workers don't actually do anything. I think that's what I really learned from my father, from his experiences in Spain, because basically that was what they did in the Spanish Revolution, in cities at least. They simply got rid of all the white-collar workers. And nothing much changed. Trains still ran, factories still produced things, buses still worked. Turns out those guys don't actually do much of anything. It can't be done by, people on the job, in their spare half hour or hour a day. Mainly they're just there to make you feel bad about yourself in various ways. All right, so... Okay, so I came from a background where, well, why not be an anarchist? It seems plausible enough. And so I thought of myself as one, but it didn't really mean much. Occasionally I'd try to get involved. This is the 80s. Maybe I just had bad luck in what I tried to hook up with, because it was my experience that a lot of the people I met were kind of jerks. It seemed like, I always call it the Bob Black period of anarchism. It was a period where everybody seemed to be this little sectarian party of one person yelling at each other. And I would kind of go and be disturbed and after a few days leave again. So I never got involved, but I decided to become an anthropologist. I ended up going to Madagascar for one reason or another. And by sheer coincidence, kind of, I stumbled into a place where the state had in fact disappeared. I was living in an anarchist society. But the fascinating thing is it took me a while to figure it out. People had warned me at first, well, I hear the state authorities disappeared in a lot of the countryside, you should look out. So I went off, and I was in a small town, which was also in the surrounding countryside, but, the town was like an hour's drive out of the capital. It's hardly out in the boonies anywhere. And, there was government offices, there were people in the government offices typing things, there was a police station, a gendarme station, and various other state facilities. So, it seemed obvious there was a government here. But as time went on, I realized there was something kind of weird going on here. I think what gave it away is I heard this story about this guy named Henri, who was this enormous, scary guy who was either insane or pretending to be insane. People seem to have mixed opinions on this one, but all agreed that he was terrible, and he would, he was violent, he would beat people up, he was sexual assault, he would steal things and take things and dare people to do something about it. So eventually people thought something needed to be done about this guy. And this is a town of 10,000 people, right? And as I learned, there seems to be this sort of basic principle in Madagascar that if you want to lynch someone, you have to get their parents' permission first. Which, if you think about it, make sure it really doesn't happen very often. If it does, there's probably a very good reason. So basically, it's a way of ensuring that, your dad can go, or your mom can go up to you and say, "Look, kid, you really better clean up your act." I don't know how much longer I can front for you here. All right. So after about 3 tries, his father said, "To hell with it, whatever. You're right. The guy's crazy. It's impossible. So they kind of, sort of Frankenstein, they came out with agricultural implements, and he was injured and immediately ran into the local Catholic church and demanded sanctuary. He said, help, help, I'm being persecuted, he's mentally ill. And the priest, they were going to come in after him there. So the priest eventually loaded him into the back of a van and took him off to an insane asylum where they kicked him out 3 days later for beating up the other patients, but he never came back, so it kind of worked out. But be this as it may, when I was hearing the story, I suddenly realized, wait a minute, there's like a police station right over there, why didn't they do something about it? And they were like, yeah, but have you seen Henri? Like, he's enormous. I don't want to fight him. Yeah, but they have guns, If I shoot him, come on. So there seemed to be this idea that, it really wasn't any of their business. And I eventually figured out the police basically were there to keep the highway open. And they wouldn't go off the paved road. So what this meant is, like, unless you're actually in the town itself, first of all, nobody was paying any taxes, police would not come. The paved road is very limited. And even in the town, they wouldn't do much. But the fascinating thing was they'd set it up in such a way that you wouldn't know until you'd lived there for a while that there was no state operative in this area. Because there were people who seemed to work for the government. Later I learned that they weren't really being paid and they even had to buy their own paper and fill out the forms, because the government was basically providing nothing. But they were keeping up appearances, But part of the idea, I guess, like, there's a sort of traditional mode of resistance. Malagasy are masters of passive resistance. So these guys figured out that, under the French colonial period, for example, they were trying this sort of thing. Their basic approach is, like, if somebody shows up and wants you to do something you really don't want to do, the first line of defense is be nice to them, give them coffee, agree with everything they say. When they go away, pretend the incident never happened. What guy? No, nobody came through telling us anything. There's layer on layer of defense that these guys have developed. And it didn't work that well under the French. Suddenly, when the French government went away, it was working better and better. The IMF was basically cutting the budget. They just simply cut police to the rural areas as they figured people were running their own affairs anyway. They weren't getting any taxes out of it to speak of even before that. What eventually happened is that, the government effectively dissolved, but they were still playing this game of making, this sort of tacit deal, like, we will never embarrass you and make you feel like you're an important person who has authority as long as you don't actually try to exercise it in any way. And so everybody was playing along this illusion of the state that didn't actually exist. So it was an interesting test case in a lot of ways. In fact, I find it a very compelling argument to use to people, again, one of the most common arguments against anarchism is that, you can't get police because people will just start killing each other. This is considered self-evident, right? No evidence needs to be produced. Well, actually no, this can be empirically tested, and that doesn't happen. There was a case, police went away, nobody killed each other, any more than they did before, which isn't very much. Pretty nonviolent society. And I think there's many places in the world like this, by the way, where states have disappeared, but we don't know because, people are too, sometimes if you are a rebel, you realize that the stupidest thing you could possibly do would be to put up a flag and say, ha ha ha, I'm a rebel, we're autonomous now. Then they kind of got to crack that. No, government right here, I'm sure there's lots of places like that in the world. Anyway, so it makes you think, like, okay, well, if that's not true, there are cases like Somalia, but Somalia is a case where the government broke down while people were already in a civil war. For every case like Somalia, which you hear about because there's violence, there's probably a dozen like Madagascar where nobody even knows. All right, so you have this happen. Well, it makes you think, well, wait a minute. What is it about living under a state, under someone else's authority, under the constant threat of violence if you break the rules, that actually causes behavior that makes it seem self-evident that people would behave violently if there wasn't such structures. Because in fact, if there aren't such structures, that's not how they are. Anyway, okay, so there I was in Madagascar. I come back, I get a job, I'm teaching at Yale. One day I walk out of class, and there's a newspaper box that says, excuse me, says martial law declared in Seattle. I'm like, what? Which is what most people in America say at that time. And you know, soon enough I discovered that the social movement that I'd always kind of wished would exist, but didn't, actually had formed during the time that I wasn't paying attention. I immediately, thank you. This is my fourth of it today. My immediate reaction was like, great, where do I join? No, this is fun. So I got involved in the Direct Action Network in New York, and there are, I guess, two things that really kind of really surprised me, and which I've been trying to think about how to deal with ever since. One is that, you know, people were trying to develop this model of consensus-based direct democracy, which may identify with the anarchist tradition that comes out of Quakerism and feminism just as much or more. But anarchists have really adopted it because it's a type of process that could work in a society without coercive enforcement of decisions. And, you know, it was a wonderful thing for me, but I suddenly realized that, you know, that is what people were doing in Madagascar. In fact, that's how decisions had traditionally been made in Madagascar for, you know, 1,000 years, probably. And one reason I hadn't been completely able to understand what I was seeing when people did that at the time was that it was so natural to people that, you know, nobody really talked about it. It was just how you do things. Whereas us, as Americans, even though we thought we lived in a democratic society, you know, how many of us have really had any experience sitting down with a whole bunch of people making a collective decision on an egalitarian basis? You know, maybe when we're ordering pizza or something. Not very often. I realized that because we didn't know what we were doing, we had to like think about it very self-consciously, and as a result, it was possible for me to understand retrospectively. Oh, that's what that guy was doing. You know, he was blocking. So that was one thing. I realized that, you know, we were just desperately trying to figure out things that people, places like that, you know, this totally comes naturally to them. And the other thing that sort of complementary disturbing thing I figured out, more disturbing, was that, you know, a lot of these groups, they kind of define themselves against kind of a group like the Direct Action Network, the kind of group that we were trying to not be, what we thought of as our opposite on the political left. So imagine the sort of you know, Trotskyist or Maoist sort of sectarian little group that, you know, has 24 members, but nonetheless is a political party because it dreams of taking state power. You know, it's got an intellectual leader who has always right about everything and get kicked out if you disagree. Okay, you know all that. Anyway, so we were trying, you know, in a way we were trying to define our own organization as the opposite. We don't have to agree on reality. We all live in incommensurable worlds, but we're trying to agree on action, process, and how we go about things. But what I realized was that the mode of argument and discussion that encouraged when we were doing these kind of meetings, I felt very excited, was in a way it was the exact opposite of the sort of sectarian motive debate that I've been seeing all my life, typical of such groups. I kind of made up this half-humorous list of how to identify a sectarian motive argument. Number one is, you know, if listening to another person's perspective, if they say something, there's two ways to interpret it, one of which suggests they have some small amount of common sense. Don't choose that one. Always assume you're different. And number two is like sort of the way of, those guys like walk around a list of 24 ways to be wrong, and they've just listened to you long enough to figure out which category of wrongness to stick you into. That's the other one. You know, it's like, oh, you're a cooperativist. You think, and then they start lecturing you about what you think because they don't need to listen to what you say anymore. Okay, so that's number two. And the third is, of course, you know, treating like minor theoretical differences as terrible moral flaws. Like, you disagree with my interpretation of Bartleby the Scrivener, you are a racist. Okay, so, all right, so what I realized was, you know, that sectarian argument, which is like exactly what these people were trying to get as far as possible away from, and thus coming to approximate the way people discuss it in Madagascar, was in fact almost identical to the way that I had been taught to argue at the University of Chicago as a graduate student. I resisted, but I still, yeah. So it gave me sort of an identity crisis. I realized, well, okay, like if we're not vanguardist, if we're not, you know, the purpose of intellectuals is not to come up with the correct analysis, to the group that has the correct analysis to bring the masses to the appropriate level of consciousness so they can understand what we already understand, all that kind of stuff, which we know where that leads. All right, if we're not going to do that, well, what is the role of the intellectual in these other types of social movements? And what can we actually contribute? Assuming that we actually can contribute something. I'd like to think we could. So, a certain investment in that. So I thought, all right, what do we do? And I've been thinking about it ever since. I've come up with a lot of possible approaches. I wrote ethnography of direct action because I kind of realized that, you know, we're very good at showing people why direct democracy and direct action are compelling, but like explaining it to others, we're not that great at. And I thought just by ethnography could actually be useful in sort of teasing out the underlying principles that people are entirely aware of what they're already doing. I did that. Got in trouble for it, but it was a good book. I wrote this thing called Fragments of Anarchist Anthropology. I wrote a whole bunch of things. But I ended up writing this book on debt. And it's really part of the same. In a way, it's all inspired by one question. Which is, what is the cause of the terrible moral power that debt has over people? The idea of debt. And I start the book with a little anecdote. It starts, I'm at Westminster Abbey for some reason. I was in this party for Westminster Abbey. It's kind of a long story. And a garden party. It was curious. It was special. Father Graham was a priest who invited me. He was a very gracious host. He kept inviting me to everyone, but he had this incredibly annoying habit of like saying, hello, this is meet David Graeber. He's an anarchist. Yeah, okay. That kind of limits the possibilities of conversation. So he introduced me to this one person. I was like, oh, this person you're really going to like. She's a lawyer. She's an activist like you, community causes. So I chatted with her for a while, and I thought I was amongst friends, so I was talking about anti-IMF campaigns and drop-the-debt campaigns, talking about structural adjustment policies. And actually, I was telling the story about Madagascar because, you know, IMF structural adjustment policies have had profoundly ambivalent effects on Madagascar. On the one hand, they're largely responsible for the fact that the police disappeared because people, you know, they had to cut the budget somehow. We're not getting any income from the countryside anyway. Cut services, which security services went first. Of course, other places they would have gone last, but that's one thing you can say for Madagascar. Commend them. Okay, so, but on the other hand, they also cut things like malaria eradication programs, you know, which had been in place for generations. So, you know, malaria returned where it hadn't been for 50 years, and everybody lost their immunity. And I think 10,000 people died in the Highlands alone in the year and a half before I showed up. About half of whom were children. Telling stories like this, and you know, she said, "Well, what was your proposal to do about this?" And I said, "Well, I canceled the debt." You know? There's groups like Jubilee 2000. They're talking about the debt campaigns, and she was like, "Well, wait a minute, I mean, they borrowed the money, I mean, surely you have to pay the debts. And, I remember it was one of those, oh, no. But I thought I was amongst friends here. So there's okay, there's 25 different things I could say now. Which of the ones shall I pick out? No, they didn't really borrow the money. Yes, they repaid it like 4 or 5 times, but through the miracle of compounded interest, they still have to pay it 4 or 5 times more. Or even the economic argument. Because, the fascinating thing about this is it's a moral argument. It's not an economic argument. Because, economically, in fact, what capitalists like to say is that the justification for profit is the willingness to accept risk. If you lend money, you're supposed to be taking a certain risk, which you're not going to have if nobody can default, right? That's why you make intelligent investment decisions. That's the purpose of a financial system, supposedly to bring the money to wise investments. So if, there was some system that people had to pay back no matter what, if I just walked into the bank and I said, hey, can you give me a couple $1 million? I got a hot tip on the horses, Normally they will say, yeah, dream on. But if they knew they could collect it no matter what happened, because they could, I don't know, sell my sister into slavery or something, or my organs or whatever it would be. What's to stop them from making any kind of idiotic loan, and then no money goes to people actually who start a laundromat. Okay, so even according to economists, this is stupid. This idea that everybody must pay their debts in all circumstances. But actually, I think that always is the one I ended up trying. The interesting thing is, when I talked to fellow activists about this, the usual reaction was like, oh yeah, that conversation. Everybody's had it. And I thought about it more. I thought, okay, I just told her a story about 5,000 dead babies. Under what other circumstance would an obviously very nice, well-meaning person try to justify killing 5,000 babies? Yeah. Probably not. Maybe collateral damage, I don't know. But really, basically not. So what is it about debt that makes us able to justify things that you just never think to be able to justify in any other circumstance? And that's really what set off my writing the book. Took me a while to get to. And the answer was complicated. And one of the things I discovered quite very quickly is that there's been a profound moral ambivalence about debt pretty much throughout human history. As far back as we know to go. Some of the first written records we have are actually accounts of debt. But it's always double charged, in the sense that pretty much any place you look, there is both the notion that morality and paying your debts are kind of the same thing.
It seems that our national wealth is very widely distributed, much more than I realized.
Sorry. I'll start reading now. All right, yeah. So we have the situation where, you have this terrible ambivalence. So that you have people saying, on the one hand, morality is debt. Like in many languages, the word for debt, guilt, and sin are the same. So on the one hand, you have that. On the other hand, so morality, paying your debts are the same thing, as the person said. But on the other hand, you also have the profoundly held notion that anybody who lends money for a living is evil. How do you reconcile those two things? And that was one of the first things that I was trying to figure out. Actually, I found this great story in a medieval Japanese Buddhist monk who wrote an account of strange happenings during his time. And one of them is about this moneylender. She was married to a governor, and she was known to be completely unmerciful and exacting in her loans and would charge high interest rates and send people scurrying and hiding, wandering about in other provinces trying to hide from her, ruining lives all over the place. And when she died, saying prayers over the body after 2 days, suddenly she, sort of sprang back to life, but she was half ox. It was this horrible, deformed monster, which everybody panicked, and they started trying to pay restitution to all the people she'd taken money from and give all the rest of the money to monasteries until finally she mercifully died. And the monk was like, well, clearly this is a case of premature reincarnation. Essentially, what happened here, he said, well, it says in the sutras, because Buddhism is interesting, it's one of the few world religions that it doesn't object in principle to lending money at interest. Islam, Christianity were all against usury, and Buddhism wasn't necessarily. But they said, all right, it says in the sutras that if people lend you money and you don't pay it back and you die, you might well end up being reborn as an ox in their barn. So you should pay your debts. On the other hand, it's obviously the case that if you're too mean about, demanding the money back, and you're too aggressive, you could get reborn as an ox in their barn, which was obviously what was about to happen to her. Except I guess she'd been too mean to too many people, so it just became even worse. So this kind of bad ox. I remember thinking about this and saying, well, wait a minute. That doesn't make any sense, because you're not going to be aggressively demanding the money back unless the person hasn't paid. So that means they were about to get born as an ox in your barn, but then if you're too mean about it, then you get born as an ox. So how do you decide who's an ox in the other one's barn? Is it a sort of judgment call by the powers that be, who was being too mean or who was being too remiss? And it just brought home the degree to which Dan is always surrounded by the sense that one party is definitely at fault and the other party is probably at fault, and in fact everybody's probably to blame. Is horrible. Despite that, think about it, most people who have ever lived have been debtors, at least at some point in their lives. So the first thing I started looking at is how it is that we come to think of moral relations as debts in the first place, despite the fact that it has such disturbing implications, that everybody's basically rotten, or that social relations are basically rotten. Because, it occurred to me that really this is what happens when you try to imagine the world as all human social interactions anyway, as resting on the principle of exchange. Which people on all sides of the sort of intellectual divides, economists do it, but even people argue against economists have a tendency to do so as well. We have this weird thing in social theory that we want to reduce everything to exchange, despite the fact that it's kind of obvious that it's not true. You have everything from the economists saying everything is an interested transaction, calculating your interest, and to people on the other side of Claude Lévi-Strauss saying, well, everything is reciprocity. It's language is the exchange of words, and economics is the exchange of goods, and he said kinship is the exchange of women, and small exchange. And I've always been fascinated by this. This is so obviously false, What is it that compels us to do this? I ended up first having to map out, what are the basic moral principles behind economic transactions? We have to start by that. So I came up with a formula. I like it. It's a little, minimal start. You could probably make it more complicated, but let's say there are 3 basic principles whereby we interact with one another. Moral sort of principles which can regulate transactions or anything else for that matter. I will call them communism, hierarchy, and exchange. Because, if you define hierarchy, if you define communism, not as, some state where everybody owns things in common, but rather, the classic definition of the term, from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs. Well, most of us use that principle when dealing with people we really like, who are best friends, people in our family. And all societies are based on a minimal level of communism. communism, in the sense that, if the need is great enough, like I'm drowning, or the cost is small enough, like you got a light. Well, we don't actually keep count of who gave what to who, even strangers will do things for you. In fact, in a lot of societies, it goes a lot further than a light or directions or something like that. It would go to food, for example. If you're not an enemy, and if somebody asks you for food, you can't really say no. There's this great Maori story I always like to tell about this famous glutton named Terenga, who used to take advantage of this and would just go up and down the beach, and whenever fishermen came back, he would say, "Oh wow, squid, I love squid." People say, "Okay, yeah, take the squid." You just do this every day, no matter what people would catch. And after about 2 years, people got so sick of it that they formed a war party and killed him. It's actually easier to just bash someone's head in than to say, "No, I'm not going to give you the squid." So these are actually very powerful moral things. All right, so you have communism, this sort of basic level where everybody... And it's a practical thing, too. That's the thing about communism. We have this idea communism doesn't work. But, if you define it this way, it's often the only thing that works. So that's why, corporations, like if I'm working for a corporation and I'm fixing a leak in the pipe and I say, "Hand me the wrench," the other guy doesn't say, "Yeah, what do I get?" Actually, you apply principles that from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs, because it actually is practical. I wanted to make an argument, actually, that capitalism is actually just a bad way of organizing communism. We're all communistic. Sociability is essentially communistic. But, all right, so you got communism, you got exchange, and immediately becomes easy to see the difference between exchange. Communism is egalitarian, but it's based on the idea that you treat people as if they'll always be around. You're communist with people like, your mother or your best friend. You act as if they'll always be there, so you don't really need to keep track of who gave what to who. Exchange is the opposite. It's between equals, but it's temporary. I give you this, you give you that, we walk away, we have nothing further to do with each other. So that if we had not completed the transaction, there is a debt, and that's where debt occurs. But it's all meant to be restoring the equality you had before, but then the problem is you don't have any relations at all. And then finally, there's hierarchy, and this is actually, nobody ever talks about this. It really annoys me. This is the most obvious example of lack of reciprocity governing things. People will give the example of, well, what if you give money to a beggar? They're not going to give you anything back. They might expect you to do it again. I gave money to the United Farm Workers once, and I never heard the end of it. So you have that, but actually, I think that's how hierarchy works. It's based on a logic of precedent. If two people are assumed not to be equal at all, then what one person does is given as a sign of what the type of inequality this is, what the nature of the relationship is, and if you do it, they expect you to do it again. Or if you do something back, it's different. So you can give $1 to a bum and they're like, thanks, so they're not going to give you $1 back. I mean, if it turns out they're actually, a tycoon who's drunk and on a binge and they meet you later, they could give you a Cadillac or something, right? But they're not going to give you $1. They might give you something even more. So there's fundamental inequality, this sort of things. But I actually came onto this when I was reading this book about medieval feudalism, and I ran into this thing called writs of non-prejudice. Which is a specific type of document, because in the Middle Ages it was just accepted that since relations between unequals, and nobody's really equal to anybody in the Middle Ages, were based on principles of custom. There's a web of custom. Any new act is considered a precedent, which shows what which is expected to be repeated. So one example Mark Bloch, the historian, gave was there was this lord who had a bear. As a pet bear, and the peasants thought the bear was really cool, so they raised a fund to support the bear. Bear died, they still had to pay it for the next 200 years, because once you make a payment to a lord, then you're expected to do it again every year. And this would happen all the time in the Middle Ages, and the only way to get out of it is, like if you give a present to someone, you'd have to actually have them sign a document saying, just because I gave it to you this year, I don't have to do it next year. So that's hierarchy. Now, so all these moral principles sort of infuse our relationships with one another. I notice it all the time, even in interpersonal stuff, right? You know, if you're nice to people, they'll expect you to do something back, but if you're so nice to someone, they just define you as a superior, nice person, then they just expect you to do nice things for them all the time, and they'll get really mad at you if you don't, this sort of thing. So these are basic moral principles, but debt only occurs as a side effect of exchange. But if you define all human relations not as this complicated mix of communism, hierarchy, and exchange, which is what's actually going on in the world, but rather just as exchange, which for some reason social theorists invariably wanted to do ever since the rise of sort of commercial society, then what happens is, if people have ongoing social relationships, then it's because there's an incomplete exchange. And in some places that's a good thing. You know, like there's like a lot of, you know, in societies where there's a famous ethnography, the Tib, where the anthropologist goes and people start giving her gifts, and they bring in some okra, some fish, here's some this, here's some that, potatoes, and she doesn't know what to do, so she just writes down whatever he brings. She's like trying to figure out, somebody adopts her, takes pity on her, and says, well, you are supposed to give that back, but you can't give them something of the same value as what they gave you. You have to give them a little bit more or a little bit less. Because if you give them something worth exactly the same of what they gave you, then it's like saying, yeah, whatever, I don't have anything to do with you anymore, bye. You know, so everybody has to remain just a tiny bit in everybody else's debt, and that's society. So it can be okay in a circumstance like that. But, you know, obviously they are your very closest people with whom you share, very distant people, but in that kind of middle range, it's okay. But, you know, if all relations are suddenly reduced to exchange, then you only have relations with people if there's an incomplete debt. And that means that, like, you know, one party is definitely to blame, and probably both of them are. So social life itself is somehow bad and corrupt, which is, oddly enough, what a lot of, you know, religions and other people do conclude in very commercial societies. So life is sin. And words for sin, as I say, and debt and guilt tend to overlap. Here's the interesting thing. So there's one question, you know, debt becomes raised. The other question is, how do we frame debt in the way that we do, as necessarily something that's impersonal and quantifiable? This has to do with the origins of money. And I can't tell the story in great detail, but I will say this much. Everything we are told about the origins of money is completely wrong. I mean, I kind of knew this. I'm an anthropologist, and you know, you read an economics textbook, it'll tell you the same story that people have heard a million times, right? You know, once upon a time there was a Neolithic village, and people would have to swap things, and they'd say, well, you know, I need a cow to slaughter for a feast. How am I going to get that cow? I'll tell you what, I'll give you 27 chickens for that cow. No, I'll have it 30, 35 going. You know, once you figure out how many chickens are willing to take, you know, you swap. But like, then it happens one day that he doesn't want any chickens, or anything else you happen to have. What are you going to do? Damn, we're going to have to invent money. Well, really, this is the story everybody learns when you're a kid. So first there's barter, and then there's money, and then there's credit, and eventually you've got securitized derivatives, and you know, it all goes on. And there's a basic problem with this story, which is that, like, anthropologists have been going around the world for 150 years at least, trying to find a place where people say, tell you what, I'll give you 37 chickens for that cow. They don't exist. Which is interesting because, you know, like, people have come up with an awful lot of different ways to organize, like, local economies. But, you know, there's a million things they do, but they never do that. I guess there's a logical reason, which is that, you know, it assumes that people in a small Neolithic village will only operate by what economists like to call the spot trade. You know, we walk in, here's something, you give me something, bye-bye, we walk away. Which is stupid, because, you know, like, say the guy doesn't eat my chickens, even if we were doing this, like, for God's sake, I'm his neighbor. I'm going to have something he wants eventually. It's just silly, So he, the logical thing would be to give me the cow, and then like, haha, you owe me one. Which it's nice to have your neighbors and your dad. And in fact, that's what you actually find in relations between the sort of people who would be doing exchange rather than something else. They're usually neighbors of equal status. And what actually happens is it's like the praising the squid. You walk in and you say like, wow, that's a beautiful cow, It's like, so you can't not give it to them. It's like, oh, right, fine, take the cow. No, it's a gift. Don't even think about giving me anything back. And of course, now, you owe me one. And something like a cow, there's usually big ranks of types of things, like a cow is a kind of equivalent to a really nice necklace or, a canoe, and a chicken's sort of equivalent to something else. So you have ranks of types of things, but it also doesn't have to be a thing, Could be like, gee, my son is really in love with your daughter, it could be a million different things. Or it could be, I just like to have the guy on my dad. It makes him nervous. It's all caught in social relations. And this is what economists are trying to do. They're trying to eliminate social relations. Let's imagine people are just about the stuff. So, that attitude where people are just thinking about the stuff and walking away as soon as possible is something that's only possible once you invent money and have markets. So it's really like taking these motivations which are created through markets and then using them as the reason why markets develop. It's sort of like saying that we invented the game of chess because we already had a desire to checkmate each other's kings. But that's what we're taught. But then the question is, how does that turn into actual money? Money being, able to say exactly how many, 37 of these equals 2 of these. That's the first thing money does. And the answer seems to have nothing to do with trade. It really can't. Because, if somebody gives you a counter gift and you don't think it's really adequate, I give you 10 chickens for your cow and think we don't know each other anything anymore. I might make fun of you and mock you as a cheapskate, which is devastating in a small society. But I'm not going to come up with a mathematical formula to say exactly how cheap I think you are. On the other hand, say we are drunk and I'm mocking you as a cheapskate and blows are exchanged and someone's ear gets cut off. There's a whole other thing. And this is the situation where actually you do start having to quantify, because in such societies they might not have markets, but you often find extremely elaborate schedules of fines and penalties for different things. And that's exactly the sort of circumstance where people aren't least likely to be compromising and understanding. My ear was just cut off. That says 27 heifers for that. And I want them now, and really good ones, or this means war. And a few at least. And in a situation of violence and potential violence, suddenly people start getting really exact. And in fact, if I don't have heifers, then I have to figure out something, and we have to figure out how many silver plates equals heifers. And that's what you actually find when people start figuring out these sort of quantifications. Early medieval Welsh and Irish law codes are actually a classic example of this sort of thing, because they didn't actually have markets where you could buy stuff, most stuff. Some types of agricultural products you could probably buy, but most of the things in a house you couldn't buy, silverware, cauldrons, but they had the exact law codes mapped out exactly how much everything in a house would be worth, so you could figure out how to do compensation for fines, which were mostly about insulting somebody's honor. They had this great system where everybody's honor was measured, and if you do something dishonorable, you're demoted, and you have an honor price. And if somebody insults you, then they have to pay your honor price. Even if they kill you, if they kill you, it's like 12 cows for killing you and 24 cows for insulting you, not killing you. So you needed to be able to make these calculations. And that seems to be where money, in the modern sense, seems to first emerge. So it's caught up in violence. And that, I think, it helps explain why debt has this strange relation with violence. So, because a debt is just a promise, but it's a promise that's made impersonal by mathematics and coercion. And because it's impersonal, and mathematical, it's also transferable. As I was saying two previous times today, if I just made it up, but I'll use it again. If I promise to meet you at 5 o'clock, you can't give that to someone else. But if I promised you $5, you can actually give that to someone else. In fact, some people would say that's what $5 is, if they promise to pay $5 worth of something. It's an IOU. Actually, that is what money is. Just a little known fact, a 10-pound note here. This is back in the UK. Money is actually circulating government debt, and most people don't know this. The Bank of England was created in 1694 when a bunch of merchants loaned some money to the Queen, or King William II? Third. King William III, he wanted to fight a war, and so it was a war. And they lent him some £1.2 million, and he said, okay, great, you can take that money I now owe you and lend it to other people in the form of banknotes. Which is great, because they're collecting interest twice, once from the king, and from the other people they lent the money that the king owed them to. But it means that if the king ever paid back the debt, there would be no money. So, this is what, when they say, oh, we have this deficit, we need to pay back the federal debt. Nonsense. Our system works the same way. If there was no debt, there would be no money. We have to have debt. But in the 10-pound note, they even admit it. Here's the queen, right? And there she is. And next to it, she's saying, I promise to pay the bearer the sum of 10 pounds. So this isn't 10 pounds. It's a promise to pay 10 pounds of something, which you can then cancel off against the money that you owe her in the form of taxes. Sort of double negative. All right, so debt. So money essentially is circulating debt, quantified. But it always involved in a war. I mean, the coinage, for example, is a classic example. Coinage was basically invented to pay soldiers. It crops up, because at first they're using credit systems. Ancient Sumerians, they had money, but they didn't even actually make scales accurate enough to weigh out the tiny amounts of silver that would have been required to buy a chicken or something like that. They knew how, but they didn't bother. Because nobody actually spent silver on chickens. They just tapped everything up and paid it 6 months of a year. It's the way it used to work in England until the 1600s or 1700s, really, in a village. Nobody actually had cash. There wasn't much of it around, and anyway, it was considered sort of uncouth. So everybody, just kept track of who owed what to whom, and every 6 months to a year, they'd have what they called a reckoning. They just sit down and say, okay, you owe 5 shillings to him, he owes 40 to you. They sort of cancel it all out in a big circle, and then anything that's left over, somebody would give somebody a pig or something. So that's how money worked through much of history. It's like they didn't actually use cash. But then when they invent money, it's largely tied to military things. It always seems to be related to violence in some way. And that makes sense too, because it doesn't make sense if you take the sort of Adam Smith version where money arises from the inconvenience of barter, because if that were true, one of the great mysteries actually is why kings, ancient or medieval kings, wanted taxes in the forms of money. Because, if money is just happens spontaneously, why can't the king just grab the gold and silver mines, and then he's got all the money? What's the point of taking the gold and silver, stamping your picture on it, giving it to people, and then saying, okay, everybody give it back again? Think about it, it's kind of arbitrary. Well, it doesn't make a lot of sense unless you realize that feeding an army was really, really hard under ancient conditions. Basically, here you have 50,000 people, they're all sitting in the same place. What are they going to eat? Basically, anything within walking distance is going to be gone in about 2 weeks. So unless you are going to hire another 50,000 people just to feed them, you have to figure out something. And soldiers are likely to be looting and pillaging, that's what they do, and they're people most likely to actually have lots of gold and silver, which might be used as a sort of abstract measure of exchange, but isn't actually used in transactions. You have credit systems. But, okay, who wants to extend credit to a soldier, right? They're the stupidest people you would possibly want to extend credit to. They're heavily armed, and they're probably just passing through anyway. So, you know, like, but they got these little lumps, right? And so the logical thing to do is, you know, you have like these little market systems that are probably already happening near where soldiers are. So you take the gold and silver and say, okay, I'm going to stamp my picture on it, I'm going to give it to the soldiers as their pay. Now everybody in the kingdom has to give me one back again. Voila, you have created a market system in which everyone in your country is employed trying to give soldiers things they want. And constant. But, and draw to a close, I won't do a reading with this, the crazy thing is how that becomes moralized. And because you find throughout history, you know, the sort of great world religions really come up in response to this creation of impersonal markets, which has to do with military operations. Almost all the great world religions start as anti-war movements in one way or another. And sort of trying to come up with a logical, you know, sort of opposite to the logic of the market. You know, if we're going to say, here's a space where we just think about how to get as many things as possible for ourselves and don't care who other people are, what they need. You know, somebody else is going to say, okay, here's a space where we think about why material things aren't important and it's better to give than to receive. I mean, they sort of it's almost logical that it will happen, and indeed that is exactly what happens. You see coinage invented almost simultaneously in the Eastern Mediterranean and China and in India, apparently completely independently. Socially, the same sort of thing is going on. You're getting these standing armies. And in exactly those times and places, you see the rise of the great world religions. But in every case, these world religions start with a sort of moral quandary about debt. They say, well, what is morality? Is it not paying your debts? And they say, no, it's not. But they always have to start that way. And, you know, this is a great puzzle. And it's even true of, you know, sort of classic works of philosophy. You know, people have read Plato's Republic, some of you, I'm sure. You know, remember how it starts? It starts, what is justice? They ask, what is justice? And this rich guy's name is Kephilos, which means capital. He says, oh, come on, simple thing. Justice is just a matter of telling the truth and paying your debts. And Socrates says, no, it isn't. That's ridiculous. You know, what if somebody, you know, I borrow somebody's sword and then they go violently insane and want it back to kill people. You know, of course I won't give it back and I'll probably make up some lie as to why I can't, you know. So that doesn't work. And they're like, okay, well, fine, something else then. And the rest of the book is trying to figure out what. But that happens over and over again. You know, they start, what is morality? It's just debt. It's just paying your debts. No, actually, that doesn't work. I mean, in the Brahmanas and the sort of Hindu scriptures, life is a debt you owe to the gods. And by the time they're done with it, it becomes obvious that no, it's not actually. The idea that you could be in a relation of debt to the entire cosmos is itself absurd. The only way to realize you're not in debt is to realize you are part of the cosmos. The solution in the biblical stuff, it starts the same. Words for sin and debt are the same. In Aramaic, oh, this is true. Actually, the Lord's Prayer actually reads, forgive us our debts, just as we forgive our debtors. This whole trespass thing was added later. Which is interesting if you think about it, because, you know, we don't forgive our debtors, do we? so it's kind of a way of saying, yeah, you deserve to go to hell. But it might be good to you anyway. All right, but debt forgiveness is what's sacred, not the debts themselves. So in every case, they start by saying morality is debt, and then they say, well, okay, except now it's not. Well, why is that? I think the best conclusion I could come to is that debt is the most effective means ever developed to take a relation of arbitrary power and make it seem more, not only moral, but to make it seem like the victims are the ones who are immoral. You know, if I am a mafiosi, I definitely understand this. I'm a conqueror. I come in and say, okay, I conquered you. I could have killed you and I didn't. Therefore, you owe me your lives. I do expect payment for this. But, you know, I'm a nice guy. I'm going to let you off the hook for the first 6 months, and after that we can make a deal. But I do expect payment. And you know, suddenly you're the benevolent one. They're scurrying around feeling like jerks all the time because they can't make their payments. And, you know, it moralizes the relationship in, like, the opposite way that it might otherwise seem. However, there's kind of a worm in the bud from the perspective of the people on top, which is that it implies some relation of prior equality. It's like, you know, a debt is some people who should be equal, but somebody messed up. And as a result, it seems to make people really indignant. Like the vast majority of all revolts in world history have been about debt, much, much more than have been about anything else. You know, serfdom, slavery, caste systems, any form of oppression you can think of. I mean, people do revolt, but it seems like if you tell somebody they're inferior, that's going to annoy them. But if you tell people you should be my equal, you just messed up, that's going to really annoy them. And you know, as a result, I mean, Moses Finley had this famous line that you know, there was basically one revolutionary agenda in most of human history, which is like, you know, cancel the debts and redistribute the land. That was pretty much it, in that order. But once you know, once someone says you are in my debt, you know, you're a loser, it's kind of hard to come up with any other response. But well, yeah, wait a minute, who owes what to who here? Which is in fact what people have said throughout world history. But the moment you do that, you are in fact accepting that morality and debt are the same thing. You know, you're suddenly bought into the master's language. And that's, I think, why these religious scriptures, you know, who have to use the political language of the day, all start by saying, okay, yeah, morality is debt. And then they say, except no. So that moral ambivalence has been with us for thousands of years. We still haven't quite figured out a way to work our way out of the box. And it seems to me that in order to, the notion of debt has come to color our very ideas of what it is to have a moral relation, what it is to make a promise. Is what is a debt? A debt is basically a promise that has been perverted by math and violence. Strikes me that, you know, one of the most pressing political questions is precisely, well, what would a promise be? What kind of promises would free people make to one another? I don't even really know anymore. I mean, in a way, freedom is the ability to make a promise. The word free, actually, freedom, derives from a German root meaning friend. Free people are people that can make friends, because slaves can't. You know, they have no social relations. They just have to do what they're told, so they can't make promises. Free people can make promises, but you know, what sort of promises would free people make to one another? In a way, you know, I guess what the point of social movements is more than anything else is to, we don't know. I mean, but we have to figure out a way we can put ourselves into a situation where we can find out. I can see you again. Okay, anybody want to ask something?
Is this working?
Someone else want to do the
Okay.
facilitation element? Or?
Yeah. So, any questions? Okay. Start with you.
There's a few different terms with regards to debt. There's quite a few different terms, and one that I've learned is called moneta, which was incorporated in Scripture. It wasn't originally there, but was put in the Latin Vulgate, where it wasn't in the Texas Receptus. And also, those same terms in the Spanish language would be dinero and moneta, which is dinero would be the coinage or the currency, and moneta would be the coinage, or vice versa, one of the two. I might have them turned around. But I understand the term moneta was originally a pledge to a goddess.
Yeah, that goddess of memory.
Yes, so it's a death pledge or a main mortgage. And I'm wondering, the last term is that which is known as currency as opposed to money. Do you make a distinction between the two?
Yeah, I mean, indeed, because, well, you see, one of the fascinating things about economics is that economists don't actually have any consensus whatsoever as to what money even is. Which is weird, because you'd think if there's anything they'd have down by now, that would probably be Yeah. But and one of the questions is money basically currency, or is it something else? The sort of predominant one that comes out of the myth of barter through Adam Smith is that it is currency, that money begins as a medium of exchange, and then secondarily becomes a measure of value and a story value and all these other things. There is the alternative perspective, which is, the chartalists and other people that say, no, it is a form of memory, it's a form of recording debts, it's a way of measuring proportional values. Anything that enables you to say that 17 of those equals 3 of these is a form of money. And it doesn't have to be currency. Those guys are considered by mainstream economists to be kind of the marginal wing-nutty kind of guys. They're not considered crazy. There are people who teach this. There's like a couple departments where they're post-Keynesians sort of use this a lot. But they're definitely marginal, despite the fact that, as archaeologists and historians point out, every tiny bit of evidence we actually have indicates that those guys are right. So no, money doesn't have to be currency. One of the interesting questions is, and currencies can mean different things too. I didn't go into this, but like anthropologists, they used to call it primitive money, which is a terrible word. I call them social currencies. A lot of the currencies that you see in marketless societies are actually used to rearrange social relationships, and maybe secondarily to buy things, or maybe not to buy things at all. And are therefore not used to measure proportional values. So you have all sorts of different principles converging. I think one of the problems is simply that the question of what is the origin of money is a stupid question. It's sort of like saying, what is the origin of makeup, or, of music? There's some things that are just going to happen a million different times for a million different reasons in a million different ways, and combine and recombine. What is the origin of math? And because, the idea of measuring how values relate to one another and then figuring out ways to allocate them is going to happen in a million contexts. It can't be uninvented either. The question is rather, how it relates, what place it has in society and how it relates to other things. So yeah, I think one of the problems is people start with currency rather than money.
Okay, there were a few. Okay,
Just a silly one. So you commented earlier about how folks use debt as a means of manipulating people in a broad sense of things, both in a religious sense and a few other ways. Do you suspect that debt is an inborn, maybe instinctual thing in humans and maybe in other primates?
What I was trying to really emphasize with the example of communism, hierarchy, and exchange is that, sure, you can say these principles will always occur in any human society. I would actually agree with that. The problem is we have an assumption that because something will occur anywhere, it's like fundamental and it's the only thing. In fact, this is a problem I always have with arguments from human nature. It's not that they're wrong. Some people think, either there's the only way to deflect these notions that, selfishness and greed and competitiveness are in human nature is to say we don't have any essential nature at all. I take the opposite tack. I say that, we have natural urges, we just have 1,000 of them and they're all going in completely different directions. So yeah, we have urges to figure these things as debts. We also have urges not to, and to think of them as sort of monistic sharing and trust, or other ones to accept hierarchy. And there's a million different, ways that we could be disposed to see things, and we're constantly juggling them. So in a way, we are free to choose which one of our natural instincts we're going to act on. They're pulling us in every possible different direction at any time. So yeah, there's debt, but it's just one of many registers by which we get to see things. So what I was trying to look at is not just why we, when you're in a relation with someone who's you see as basically an equal but sort of separate, you feel debt, but also why you don't in other circumstances, and why we have this need now to imagine debt as encompassing everything. I'll give an example. about, exchange. Like there's Marcel Mauss, the famous French anthropologist, had a book called The Gift, where he was trying to challenge our assumptions of economists by saying, why is it we feel, if somebody gives us a gift, we feel we have this debt, we should give them something back. Even in a case where nobody's making you do it. If here, I'm Milton Friedman, I'm an economist who says everybody's trying to maximize their utility. If somebody takes me out to dinner, takes Milton Friedman out to dinner, he's going to feel like he's a schlump if he doesn't, take them out. Another economist takes him out to dinner. He'll feel somehow obliged. According to his own theory, he shouldn't feel that way. He should say, yeah, I get something for nothing, right? But in fact, he doesn't. So why is that? And that's true. Most is making a really powerful point. There's this idea of reciprocity. But it's also true that, like, if an annoying graduate student, takes Milton Friedman out to dinner, he'll probably say just going to dinner with him is reward enough, the hierarchy, right? Or if George Soros, takes him out to dinner, he probably will say, I got something for nothing. So it's, it's only between equals that apply. So, these different types of morality spring up into certain social circumstances and not others. And, a large part of, what we're really trying to understand, I'm trying to understand here is how that works, and how these very complicated different principles that could be brought to bear actually interact, and which of them we seize on and define as the essence of human nature, even though, in fact, the essence of human nature is all of it.
Your answer segued rather well into a couple of questions I have here, and I'm kind of acting as a proxy for a group in which I brought up your upcoming presentation this evening, and it's an international group of kind of middle-aged folks and of varying intellectual capacities or interests or what have you. But middle-aged folks generally, for the most part, have an interest in maintaining their status quo, let's say. We're established, we're stable. And so one fellow from Australia, he was curious because in the link that I sent to the Business Week article, it referred to Occupy Wall Street and the fact that a great many young people, are disinclined to read your book.
I don't know. That wasn't even true.
Well,
I talked to the actual librarian at Occupy Wall Street and said, what is he talking about? Like, that thing was on demand all the time. So,
okay, because his question was whether or not you had plans to either run classes or somehow educate people who wouldn't necessarily read your book. When you just referred to the whole egalitarian exchange, what you are imparting here is wonderful for those of us who want to sit down and read it, but what are, if anything, methods by which this material can reach people who wouldn't read your book? And then my other question, very quickly, somebody else in that group brought up Chris Martenson, who, like you, is not an economist, but considers himself a research scientist, and who has devised this thing called the crash course, in essence, where he is promoting increased communitarian values and what have you, lowering standard of living to increase quality of life, and so on and so on. It was all news to me. I'm just like running around like a chicken with my head cut off today, reading and finding out things and such. So the question, along with whether or not education can be provided to people who aren't going to read your book, would be, what, if anything, do you see as a parallel between what you're talking about and somebody who's simply trying to take a practical method of approach to the shit has hit the fan, and here's what we need to do about it now with regard to global debt?
Well, okay. In terms of the education stuff, I think, I don't know, as I say, I think Business Week wasn't even true, because the Occupy Wall Street librarian was so upset when they read that they actually called me and said, that's not true, everybody's, I think that in terms of getting it out, though, one of the nice things about social media, is that, probably this conversation I'm having now is going to be out on the web in a matter of days. I was just reading someone saying, well, you can check out these Graeber videos, but he always tells us the same thing, even the same anecdotes, and it's like, this piece I've given talks about this 300 times, think of it completely new, and I try to throw a little bit of new material every time. But, in other words, these things have gotten out, and people, so people do get it that way, and I try to, do this stuff in every format and every forum I possibly can. I mean, you know, it's one of the sad things about teaching for a living is that it takes up all your time, so you can't do real teaching. I was just thinking, like, if I get a big book contract or something like that, what's the first thing I'll do is reduce my teaching load so I can actually teach. Take part in some autonomous educational event. Because, where they get you is time. This is the problem. It's no discussion I've ever had has been allowed with capitalism. It would that's the only thing half the audience would know about it before they've read it, and it will color how they read everything else. I do make a suggestion about a jubilee. Yeah, I say it would be nice. And I say, basically hit the reset button on the economy would be a good idea conceptually, as much as anything else. I mean, I didn't manage to get into the whole sort of course of history, but part of my argument is that we are at the brink of a new age, but this new age is not unprecedented at all. People talk about virtual credit money as this crazy new thing made possible by computers that, has brave new world of money like we've never seen before. No, virtual credit money is the original form of money. That came first. Coins came later, 2,000 years later. And of course, nothing ever happens the same twice. But over the course of history, you do go back and forth between virtual credit money regimes where everybody kind of accepts that money is basically an IOU, to periods where you have actual use of coins and tokens of currency of one kind or another, to periods where it goes back in the Middle Ages and it goes back to money again. Periods dominated by actual hard currency tend to be periods dominated by large standing armies, wars, slavery, empires. Hopefully that's ending now. Of course, the periods dominated by virtual credit money tend to always have some sort of institution which exists to make sure things don't go out of control. Because, if money's just a promise, what's to stop people from making crazy promises? I mean, the whole thing going haywire, which, as we know, can happen. And, through most of world history, the solution was to put some kind of something in place to protect debtors. Ancient Mesopotamia, they would just cancel debts periodically, clean slates. Every new king would just say, okay, start over. Jubilees institutionalized that in a sort of 7-year, 49-year cycle. And then, in the Middle Ages, they just had anti-usury laws. You couldn't exact interest at all. Debt peonage was made illegal. This time around, what do? The first thing they do, instead of setting up some huge overarching institution to protect debtors against creditors, they set up the IMF and things like that, S&P, things like that, which are basically huge overarching institutions to protect creditors from debtors. They just do it completely backwards. What's the result? Well, what's the great social nightmare that, if you're a Confucian in the Han Dynasty, or you're Aristotle or Hammurabi or someone like that, and you're trying to imagine, utter, complete social breakdown, how it's going to happen, it's always the debt crisis. Everybody becomes indebted to the 1% of the population that actually has the means to create money, and suddenly, people start losing their land and losing their flocks, and they're reduced to nothing, and all they can do is sell themselves into slavery. First their family or themselves. If Aristotle were alive today, he would probably find the distinction between being so indebted that you sell yourself to work for others and being so indebted that you rent yourself to work for others to be something of a legalistic distinction. I think most people would say that crisis, which people imagine is the worst thing that can happen, is exactly the situation most people live in today. And it's because they did it backwards. But by framing this in a larger historical sense, it's a way of saying, well, no, history has changed, but obviously it never happens the same twice, but there are things that have solutions to this kind of thing that have been found in the past, and high time we start thinking about this.
I've got two totally unrelated questions to each other, but the first one is, when I went to school, I first was studying economics, and then I ended up going into biology and kind of more hard science stuff, but I wonder if you have a comment on this phenomenon I've noticed where economics, despite being on much more disputed ground as far as what is actually known, as opposed to something like chemistry or biology, I get the impression that in the economics departments, people feel much more confident that they actually know what's going on in the world than someone who's dealing with chemistry and chemicals. So kind of your comment on why, especially in the public perception, there seems to be this consensus, and you've talked about this in some of your books about, oh, there was never anything you saw more agreed upon by the public and the media than the Washington Consensus. It's clearly the way it works out, and everything is decided. So that's one question, and the other one has to do with your anarchic principles, and you've talked about if you try to set up an anarchic system, but then you actually have to fight a military that's run by a state. The states are much better at, waging warfare.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah. Well, it seems in politics, how can you ever escape that? Because that's the ultimate thing. If you can't protect yourself from military domination, how can you?
Well, okay, the answer to the second is easy. Obviously, we're not going to fight the 42nd Airborne Division in the of course. Anyway, they got nukes. But if you look at history, when revolutions win, it's rarely through combat. I mean, sometimes there's a little involved, sometimes none. Basically, anarchists win when the guys they send to shoot you don't do it. Even the Russian Revolution, there were whole armies that just deserted. That's what's got to happen. So yes, if it comes to violence and organized violence is what they're good at. It's about the only thing they're really good at. But for that very reason, they're not necessarily that good at coming up with really convincing reasons why a bunch of kids should shoot you. So I think that would be their weakness. What was the first one? The hegemony of economics?
Yeah, why are economists so confident when people in more confident fields are less confident?
Because they're so confident because that's their job. I mean, performance. It's all performance. I mean, people ask why is it that no economist could predict the housing bubble, even though it was this $12 trillion housing bubble. I was reading stuff by everyone from Dean Baker to Emanuel Wallerstein saying, there's a housing bubble, it's going to crash. And those guys, aren't even economists. Well, Dean Baker is, but Emanuel Wallerstein isn't. But the reason why, I talked to some economists, and they said, well, there's a saying, there's a phrase they use, talking down the market. You can't talk down the market, that's like a sin. So, your job is not just to describe something, your job is to create that thing by saying it's there. Of course that's the definition of a bubble, but they're the ones who are enabling the bubble to happen. In a way, the political principle, what is politics? Politics is, I always say politics is that one domain of human existence in which behavior that would otherwise be psychotic is actually effective. In the sense that, if I were to convince everybody in the world that I could breathe water, and I tried to do it, I'd still drown, right? But if I could convince everybody in the world that I was king of France, I would be king of France. That's really all it is. King of France is the guy who everybody thinks is the king of France. So as a result, and I think the political principle has overtaken economics, and that's how you get these bubble economies. Well, all we have to do is say the money's there, and people will believe it, and the money's there. And in a way, it's pervaded all social theory. We have theories of performativity and power creates reality, and both on the left and the right. The right thinks people think it through. They have this their own theory. They don't need Foucault, but across the board, there's this idea that just performance creates these realities, and the economists were the sort of priests of this religion. That was their job, is to say this stuff was there, to be very convincing about it. They're not a descriptive profession for the most part in practice. There's some guys who give sort of authority to everybody else, but then the other guys go out and just sort of their job is to go there and say, no, it's really there, all that money, yeah. That's what they do.
Hello? I have two related questions. The first one is, how would you describe in anarcho-syndicalist Spain during the Civil War, the voucher system of the anarcho-syndicalist economy, how would you compare that to our current economy, our debt-based economy, where
The what system? What was the word you used?
the anarcho-syndicalists in Spain, they used labor vouchers. Were one
Oh,
hour
vouchers.
labor.
Vouchers was your. Yeah, they use all sorts of different things, actually. There were some interesting experiments in that regard. But you have another question.
And the second question was, why do you think that this more successful, comparatively successful anarchist uprisings in cities tended to be more market collectivist, with like labor vouchers that equalize labor, with mutual aid, while the countryside has gone more rapidly towards communistic systems?
More successful ones. So what would be the unsuccessful ones where that didn't work?
But like in the Ukraine,
Oh,
the
okay.
countryside of Spain, they had more communes.
Well, I mean, you also have people. I mean, you know, the interesting thing about people have these barter systems, for example, and one of the interesting things about barter is that, as I was saying, it's not just that this sort of standard narrative. First there was barter, then there was money, then there was debt. It's not just that it's wrong. It's actually backwards. When you do have barter systems, it's because you have people who are brought up using money who are suddenly don't have any. Like in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Even when you have it as an experiment like Argentina, it's largely because there wasn't any money floating around, and people create alternate systems, or at least that's how they got so many people involved in it. So the space opens up where you have people with certain habits and dispositions, and they know how to do things in a certain way. I mean, you know, this is the reason why Marcel Mauss wrote The Gift, sort of the opening salvo of sort of modern economic anthropology. He was actually thinking about Lenin's new economic policy. He's saying, like, you know, Russia was, he said this actually occasionally, you know, Russia being the least monetized society in Europe, they still couldn't just legislate this stuff away. They had to come up with something, you know, and in fact they brought in the market wholesale again. And he said, well, this has to make us think, you know, he was a cooperativist most, you know, what are the, you know, what is money really? What is objectionable about it? What is, you know, we need to, what would an alternative actually be like? What has it been like? I mean, I think it's very naive to imagine that people will just go to a completely different system immediately. But I also think that, you know, some kind of system that resembles money is going to happen. I mean, you're not going to get rid of money altogether if you define money as some system of proportional values. No, the question is where it's going to be applied and where it isn't. I always like to say, well, you know, money's just a rationing system, right? You know, it's like you can have ration coupons for bread and ration coupons for milk, and ration coupons for cheese, you know, rationing during the war, or you can have ration coupons which are rationing coupons for anything. That's what money is. So it strikes me that on the one hand, it's hard to imagine a society in which nothing is rationed. You know, you have to have some rationing technique for certain types of resources, but it's also hard, you know, you also want to keep rationing to a minimum. One would imagine, right? If that's all money, you know, is a form of rationing, you wouldn't want to ration everything. You know, some might want to make everything free you can. But, so, you know, for me, something like money is probably going to occur in any complex social relations, set of social relations where a lot of people are strangers to one another, or, you know, which is what's going to happen in a city. And in fact, one of the things I was trying to describe in the book and counter in the book is this assumption that the moment you have anything that looks like it's a part of capitalism in any way, it's this kind of pernicious evil thing which will destroy everything, because it's just somehow we're so disposed to go crazy as soon as the money is there that we're going to, you know, like destroy all our nice relations if that happens. In fact, you know, the connection of violence and debt and money reveals, what it reveals to me more than anything else is that the one difference is they assume that the basis of the whole thing, the market is just an extension of mutual aid to strangers. So they don't have competition as the essence of, you know, it has a role, but it's not the essence of what the market is. Which makes perfect sense, because if you don't have coercive enforcement, and of course they don't have interest-bearing loans. They don't need coercive enforcement and for things like that. You can have contracts based on honor and trust, because if you don't come through, then you lose. Everybody knows that you're a deadbeat and you can't get more loans, so you have no credit, so you can't operate. So you don't. But as a result, the market means something totally different than it would mean if there was a state enforcing contracts. People have to promises become promises that you will renegotiate if circumstances change, so forth and so on. When that gets transported to Europe, where the market and military operations are very, very closely linked, the whole thing starts looking very different. But what I'm trying to get at is that rather than, if you have any sign of anything that looks like capitalism, it's inevitably going to be this worm in the butt that's going to destroy everything. Actually, some things like money, it means something totally different in different circumstances. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. This money systems which are invented, feed armies and support military operations, when they get detached from states, can turn into something very different. It's not exactly an answer to your question, but it's a contextualization of it. I'm trying to open up possibilities here. And there's nothing inherently wrong with something that looks like a voucher system or money, whatever works, because it's in the larger context in which it's placed, or whether it takes its meaning.
All right, real short question. You mentioned that earlier, more agrarian societies, closed societies, would keep track of debts and have a reckoning later. You mentioned the Welsh societies and that this was kind of a virtual currency in these Welsh societies. Now that tech and as societies grew bigger and you knew the people you were dealing with less and less, you had to move to more of a coinage thing because you couldn't offer them debt because you didn't know them. Now that we're moving to a more interconnected society, that we can track our relationships with other people more, how do you see this affecting the shift towards or away from virtual currency, and whether or not that will be a personally empowering shift or a personally oppressive shift?
It could go either way. It really depends on the larger power relations in which it's embedded. I think that there's a strong possibility that you can go back to personalized forms. My friend Keith Hart has made a big argument about this, that this is what the internet has made possible, is going back to personalized forms of money and let systems and things like that. So there's definitely a lot of people playing around with that possibility. I don't think, I think it's going to go, it can go either way. I think it can create the most invasive and pernicious forms of financializing every aspect of our existence, which to some degree it has, or it can do the exact opposite. And again, I think it's what sort of larger political structures this stuff is in and how much coercion is behind it. It's not like people, it's just the impersonality that turns people into monsters. I mean, you really have to have structures designed to turn people into monsters, although once you do, they tend to work quite effectively.
All right, hi David. So you started this, introduced yourself, talking about how the intellectual work can support movements. And we're in quite a moment right now. We're in a moment where debt on a large scale has been, a lot of it's been made visible to a lot of people about how unjust it is. People who wouldn't have expected to say that. And as it's starting to be delegitimized, it's also starting to be kind of organizing structure and infrastructure, bringing together different kinds of people with the capacity potentially to start structurally and systematically refusing to honor debt. Refusing to honor mortgages. Yeah. That'd be nice. And so I guess part of my question here is you started writing the book even before the real financial crisis.
Yeah, just before. Yeah.
But
we all know it's going to happen.
In the process of this coming together and where we are now, and in your tour and 400 talks, I'm curious about what you're seeing in terms of how this is really building towards large-scale delegitimization of mortgages, people starting to refuse to honor these debts, to build solidarity with each other, to build mutual relations, and to build the power that will help to minimize the potential for the state to repress it. And then that's the first question, what are you seeing out there? And then the second question is, the concern is that this will be rehabilitated. That a new king will come, and there'll be a new jubilee, and there'll be a reset, and we'll go back to the things as before. How do we maintain the spaces for the creativity and for the real shift of the power relations so that this more communist, more social fabric of relations can really become the power for all of us, ongoing?
Oh, very good questions.
Yeah.
Well, I wish I knew the answer. I would say this. It's very funny that I realized something was going on over the summer. I was sort of wearing two hats alternately. I was trying to publicize the book, because Noble House had me out giving talks and all the time. And, when on the days I had off, I was, working with the people who were organizing Occupy Wall Street. And I didn't want to, have them overlap too much because it seemed like, I didn't really talk about the Dead Book that much when I was doing the activist stuff, just because it seemed, like use a social movement to promote my book. That's kind of but it's kind of hard to keep them apart because every time I gave a talk about debt and there's any number of young people in the audience, 2 or 3 people would come up to me afterwards and say, "You think there's some way we could get a movement going about student loans?" And I've been really thinking about this, and it's happened over and over again. I realized that this was a real issue. And I wrote the book. I wrote the book quite intentionally to sort of to keep open what the audience was. Because I wanted this to be something which could be used as a tool by activists, by people trying to reimagine society or to critique existing structures in new ways, contextualize things in new ways. But at the same time, something that, if I'm actually part of the power structure and I'm saying like, maybe the jig is up in some ways, I have to think of something radical to do before they start hanging us from trees again. We thought we got over that by the 20s and 30s, but now it's back, if they're thinking that way. And there are increasing numbers of people in the elite, because now that I meet these guys, because financial people read this book, it's surprising how many people who really are totally part of the ruling class are sort of saying, all right, well, capitalism had a good run, but I can see how you're saying it might be pretty much over pretty soon. What do you think the next thing's going to be? Maybe we can get on top of that. So people are open in ways that, that are kind of surprising. So, I thought it was useful to frame it that way. But I do want, mainly I don't really actually think that those guys are going to, do anything radical unless they're really forced to. So I think that it's largely about delegitimization. And that's why I went after the moral power of debt, because that's one of their biggest aces in the hole. This idea that, of course you have to pay your debt. And people still, feel a strong feeling about this, despite the fact that, one thing we discovered in 2008, you can't hammer away at it enough, is, no, you don't have to pay your debts, not if you're rich. It was always the case, like I have this phrase I use, the communism of the rich in the book, that, like rich people are incredibly understanding, forgiving, and generous when dealing with other rich people, or can be. They'll play games like Goldman Sachs versus, Lehman Brothers, or, but, ultimately, when their common interests are in any way endangered, they'll come through for each other, and any debt can be renegotiated. It's recognized to be what it is. It's just when you owe the money, it's a whole other thing. Then it's morality, and I think, what we need to hammer away at as much as possible is like, they did kind of let the cat out of the bag in a million different ways in 2008, and now they want us to forget. What we learned is markets don't run themselves. Though all those incredible geniuses who are the only guys who actually know how to run an economy, we're all told that, they might be horrible people. We're not even saying they're nice, but, all other systems have failed. They're the only people who know a system that works, No, actually, they're a bunch of scam artists and idiots who have no idea what they're doing. And finally, we learned that you don't actually have to pay your debts. Not if you're AIG, like $13 trillion can just be made to disappear if they wave a magic wand. I think that provides us an angle that we just really need to push at as much as possible. And just to change the language by which we talk about these things. That's step one. I've never seen it, I know so many people who grew up in, whether it's Pinochet's, Chile or, Yugoslavia or Russia, where they say, like, I've never seen propaganda like that where I grew up. America's much worse. Everything you can possibly talk about in public is totally controlled and monitored. There's we're surrounded by words you can't use and things you can't talk about. And like we start with bribery, which, we have a total political system that's entirely based on bribery. It's the governing principle of all political life, but we can't say that. And so I think that's, one thing I was trying to do in this is to open up like a way that you can get other things in there and start talking about all the things you're not allowed to talk about. It's worked really well in places that I didn't expect. This is a fun fact about this book. This book was a #2 bestseller in Germany. Which is crazy because it's not out in German. Imagine a book in German being a bestseller in America. And I was trying to figure out why, and I realized that, again, the elites know they're in trouble. They have to do something radical, but they kind of tied themselves into knots, preempting any possible objection to what turned out to be insanely self-destructive policies. So they kind of know that, we don't really want to destroy the euro and, destroy the EU because, it's the basis of our entire society. But we box ourselves in a position where we can't forgive the debt. If you're an economist, a heterodox economist, and you come up with an argument, they've already got you covered. They know exactly what to say. But I think the reason why this took off so much in Germany is because they don't have anthropologists in Germany. Because colonial empire was taken away in World War I, so they never really developed colonial anthropology. So they don't have anthropologists. And you come in and say, well, there's this anthropologist who says that is actually, they're kind of like, well, that's completely out of left field. I'm not really sure what to say about that. So they allowed people in the elite, who wanted to have some weapon to use to undermine the accepted language, which was boxing them into a corner they didn't want to be in, gave them an excuse. So in terms of how these things can be deployed, I think that's one way. But in terms of I think the most important thing we need to do now is this work of delegitimization. And, the work is in terms of the political system, which is based, as I say, completely on bribery, we're halfway there. I mean, what is the congressional approval rate? It's 9%. It's it's never been so low. If you ask an average American politicians, you will hear obscenities very quickly. So one reason I'm hopeful about anarchism, in this country is because everybody says, well, democracy is a form of government, we need to move away from democracy. And I'm like, no, I don't think. I think when most people think of democracy, they're not thinking of government. Because, think about it. If democracy was just a matter of choosing politicians to run a government, all Americans seem to like the idea of democracy. All Americans hate politicians, and they're kind of iffy about the idea of government. So how do you reconcile this? There's already a huge potential there, that we need to change the sort of allow to blossom, to change the common sense, or allow positions that people are actually holding to be pronounceable in public. And as a way of sort of delegitimizing the existing structure. And just that act of delegitimization can itself have enormous effects. I think of Argentina as one model. Argentina, they didn't try to seize government power. They basically, que se vayan todos. So, the slogan was, all politicians are dead, let them all go, forget it. As a class, they're useless. We'll just carry on without them. So you can have local assemblies and occupied factories, and they're creating this alternate currency system, and so forth and so on. But the result was that, when stable government eventually did form, it was this guy Kirchner was the most mild social democrat who ever lived. Last person to do something radical, to restore the idea. I mean, it got to the point. It got to the point that politicians couldn't go to restaurants, of any political party, because they would they would have to wear false noses and mustaches and things, because if people would see them, they'd start throwing food or screaming at them or chasing them out of the restaurant, and that's where we have to get, basically. The political class is utterly delegitimated, and then they'll have to do something radical, like a jubilee. I mean, this is what I say when they say Occupy Wall Street. You need to come up with concrete proposals and lobby. It's no, No, I mean, we don't have to legitimate ourselves. They need to like show why they're relevant to us. We're the people. You know what I mean? Work of delegitimization, and I think that in itself, death's right is helpful too. They're hard arguments, but there's ideas on how to do that. But that very work of delegitimization might cause them to feel obliged, like in Argentina they did do it at default and basically destroyed the IMF. Because they had to do something radical to restore the very notion that government was relevant to people's lives.
Okay. It feels like we just got going, but we're going to have to wrap this up. We have 2 more questions, and then David will meet you in the lobby for book signing.
All right, just really briefly, I think one of the challenges in the more recent Occupy stuff is being able to the ability to succinctly communicate what Occupy means to someone that isn't necessarily in the orbit, and I was wondering if you, in a couple of sentences, could maybe sum up in your mind what this all means.
Well, I thought I was just kind of doing that. But
Yeah, I mean, it's along those lines, but I mean, like...
Even more succinct than that.
Yeah.
Okay. Both parties have been bought by like 1% of the population, are owned by Wall Street. Politicians aren't even talking about the problems real people have. The existing political system is based on is a system of bribery and nothing else. It has nothing to do with democracy. If democracy is going to happen, we're going to have to invent it over. There you go.
I was wondering, like, how confident you are on like states like Somalia, where there's like very clearly no government in place, but it's fallen into.
There's a lot of little governments in Somalia.
Well, like
more. That's a problem. They have multiplicity.
Just where it's more of a gang, warlord. I'm sure much more of a like organized crime kind of debt-driven, interactions, and do you think that there's a lot of potential for societies like that to become more of a mutual aid-driven, like place like Madagascar, where?
Okay, here's the weird thing about Somalia. I mean, it is true that Somalia is a place where the state collapsed when people were already fighting a civil war. So obviously it's going to turn out differently when there's a peaceful situation and states collapse. It's also true, and this is crazy, but look it up, that almost all social indicators in terms of life expectancy, education levels have gone up since the state collapsed, even in the midst of a civil war. I mean, how that happened, I'm not sure, but they're actually running a successful education system, They've actually got a fairly effective economy going despite that stuff. So, even though there's all these would-be statelets killing each other, they're still doing better without a central government than they had been when they had one. It's true. I was reading with these pirates, talking about this guy who was went to jail as a pirate, and that's how I started looking into it. And he's saying, well, his mother was complaining because he didn't come back from high school, and they wondered where he might be off with the pirates. And it's like, wait a minute, who's running the high schools in Somalia? There's no government. But there are. All these things are operating somehow. So even in a case like that, it was like the worst case scenario for the breakdown of the state. They're actually doing better than they were when they actually had a state. Go figure.